The email came in on a Tuesday afternoon while I was standing at my kitchen counter eating leftover pasta out of the container. Subject line, consulting engagement, urgent. From a name I recognized immediately because I'd heard it at 100 dinner parties over 11 years of marriage. Daniel Whitfield, my husband's boss's boss. The man whose approval had shaped almost every decision my husband had made about his career, our schedule, our vacations, our life. And there it was, in professional black and white, asking whether I had availability in the next 2 weeks to discuss a critical situation at their firm, and whether my rate was negotiable for an accelerated timeline. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down on my kitchen floor with the container of pasta still in my hand, and laughed until I had to put my head between my knees. Because for 11 years, my husband had called what I do a hobby, and now the company he'd built his entire identity around was asking my hobby to save them. My name doesn't matter much here. What matters is what I actually do, and how long it took the man I married to see it clearly. I build organizational systems for companies in crisis. Specifically, I go into businesses where the internal structure has quietly rotted while everyone was busy hitting quarterly numbers, and I diagnose what's broken and rebuild it. Communication flows, decision-making architecture, the invisible plumbing of how information moves through a company, which almost nobody thinks about until it fails catastrophically and takes 18 months of revenue down with it. I started doing this work 8 years ago, out of the spare bedroom of our house, after I left a corporate operations role that had been slowly grinding down everything I liked about myself. I had 2 clients the first year, 4 the second. By year 5, I had a wait list, and by year 7, I was turning away more work than I accepted. And I still didn't have an office, because I'd discovered I preferred working from the spare bedroom with the good window and the door that closed. My husband is named Grant. He's an executive at a mid-sized engineering firm, the kind of place with a real headquarters building and a lobby with a reception desk and a wall of framed project photographs. He has a title with the word director in it and a parking space with his name printed on a small metal sign. Those things matter enormously to Grant, and I understood that about him early, and for a long time I found it endearing rather than telling. He came from a family where his father had worked the same manufacturing job for 32 years, and measured a life primarily by whether it looked stable from the outside. Grant absorbed that framework whole, without ever examining it, and carried it into our marriage as though it were simply the way reality was organized. Here's the thing about the word hobby. He never said it cruelly. That's what made it so difficult to address. He said it the way you'd describe something charming about someone you love. At a dinner party, when someone asked what I did, he'd say, "She's got this consulting thing she does from home. It's really taken off. She's basically got a little business going." A little business? A consulting thing? Never the actual words. She rebuilds companies. Never the actual number, which by year 6 had exceeded his salary. I would sit at those tables and watch the description of my work get compressed into something small and decorative, and then I'd smile and add a detail or two, and we'd move on to the next topic, and I'd carry the compression home with me and put it somewhere I didn't have to look at it directly. Here is what makes a thing like this hard to name out loud, and why I want to be careful telling it. Grant was not a tyrant. He did the dishes most nights. He got up with the kids when they were babies, and he was genuinely good at it. He remembered my mother's birthday without prompting. If you had asked anyone who knew us in year 6 whether we had a good marriage, they would have said yes without hesitating, and they would not have been lying. The diminishment lived underneath all of that, in a register too quiet to point at without sounding like you were manufacturing a grievance. That's the whole trick of it. When something is done gently, over years, by someone who loves you, there is no single moment you can hold up and say, "There, that one, that was the injury." There is only the accumulation. And accumulation is very difficult to put on a table between 2 people and ask them to look at. There were specific moments over those years that I can still see with total clarity. The way you remember certain images from a long relationship, not the big fights, but the small, quiet ones that told you something you weren't ready to know. Year 4. His company holiday party, at a downtown hotel with a carving station and a live band nobody danced to. I was standing with Grant and two of his colleagues when one of them asked me what I did. I started to answer and Grant put his hand on my back. Affectionately, I want to be clear, this was not a hostile gesture, and said, "She does some consulting work from home. Keeps her busy. Keeps her busy." As though I were a retiree with a garden. As though the 11-month engagement I'd just finished rebuilding a logistics company's entire escalation structure was a way of filling hours. I remember the specific flush of heat up my neck, and I remember making the choice, in that moment, to laugh and say something self-deprecating rather than correct him in front of his colleagues. I made that choice a lot. Every time I made it, it got fractionally easier to make it again. Year 6. I landed the largest contract of my career, a 9-month engagement with a regional healthcare network, the kind of work I'd been building toward for years, with a fee that made me have to sit down when I read the signed agreement. I came out of the spare bedroom practically vibrating and told Grant, and he said, "That's great, honey," and asked if I'd remembered to schedule the furnace inspection. Not out of cruelty. He simply hadn't understood the scale of what I'd just said, because he'd never bothered to build a framework for understanding it. My work existed in his mind as a category, the hobby, and information about it got filed there regardless of what the information actually contained. I could have told him I'd been named to a national advisory board, and he would have said, "That's great, honey," and asked about the furnace, because the file the information landed in was already labeled, and the label determined the response before the content ever got read. I remember standing in the kitchen after that, holding a signed agreement worth more than either of us had ever earned in a single year, and having nowhere to put the feeling. I called my sister. She screamed for about 10 seconds straight, which was the correct response, and then asked me every question I'd wanted my husband to ask. How did you land it? Who's the client? What's the scope? Are you scared? I talked to her for 40 minutes. Then I hung up and went and watched television next to a man who did not know that anything had happened that day. Year 7. The worst one, and the one that finally started something moving. His mother, at Thanksgiving, asked me when I was going to go back to work now that things are settled. I said I hadn't stopped working. She said, "Oh, I know, the little consulting thing." And Grant, sitting 3 feet away with a plate of turkey in front of him, said nothing, not a word. Not a single sentence in defense of what I'd spent 7 years building. He let the room settle on his mother's description of my career, and he passed the potatoes. And later that night in the guest room, he asked me why I'd been quiet all evening, and genuinely, sincerely did not know. I tried to talk to him about it, multiple times, across multiple years, in multiple registers. Calm, direct, emotional, joking. That's the part people don't always understand about situations like this. It's easy from the outside to say, "Why didn't you just tell him?" I told him. The problem wasn't the telling. The problem was that the telling kept landing in a room where the framework for receiving it didn't exist. The first real attempt was after that holiday party in year 4. I waited until we were home, until the babysitter had left, until the house was quiet, and I said, "When someone asks what I do, I'd like you to describe it accurately." He was confused. He said he had described it accurately. I said, "You said it keeps me busy." He said, "It does keep you busy." And I sat there, realizing we were operating from such different definitions of the same sentence that we couldn't even locate the disagreement, let alone resolve it. I tried to explain what the phrase implied. He said I was reading into it. He said he was proud of me, that he told people about my work all the time, that he didn't understand what I wanted him to say instead. That last part, I think, was the most honest thing he said. He genuinely didn't understand what I wanted him to say instead, because he'd never actually understood what I did. The second attempt, 2 years later, went worse. I brought it up after the healthcare contract, after the furnace inspection comment, and this time I wasn't calm. I said he had never once asked me a substantive question about my work in 6 years. He said that wasn't true. I asked him to name a client. He couldn't. Not one. 6 years, dozens of engagements, and he could not name a single company I had worked with. He got defensive then, which is what people do when they've been shown something about themselves they weren't prepared to see, And he said something about how it wasn't fair to quiz him, and how he'd been working 60-hour weeks to support this family, and I said the thing I'd been not saying for 6 years. I make more than you do. The room went very still. He said, "That's not what this is about." I said, "No, it isn't. But you didn't know that either, did you?" He didn't answer. We didn't talk for 3 days after that. Not the dramatic silence of a fight, the worse, more domestic silence of two people being polite about the dishwasher while something unresolved sits in the room with them. And then we went back to normal, because that's what you do at year 6 with 2 kids and a mortgage. We went back to normal, and normal contained the word hobby, and I made peace with it in the way you make peace with a chronic condition. You stop expecting it to heal. You just adjust the way you carry it. I want to say something about that adjustment, because I think it's the part that will be familiar to people. Making peace with something like this is not a single decision. It's 1,000 small ones. It's deciding not to correct him at the Andersons' party, because it's already late and you want to leave on good terms. It's deciding not to bring up the client win because he's had a hard week. It's deciding, over and over, that the friction cost of insisting on accuracy is higher than the cost of letting the inaccuracy stand, and then waking up one day in year 7 and realizing that you have negotiated yourself down so many times that you can no longer locate the original price. Our kids were 9 and 6 by then, Emma and Theo. Emma is the one who noticed first, which is the part of this story that still catches me somewhere under the ribs when I think about it. Children are the most accurate anthropologists in any household. They observe the actual power structure, not the stated one, and they absorb it before anyone thinks to explain it to them. Emma came into the spare bedroom one afternoon when she was 9. I was on a call, muted, and she knew the rules about the closed door but had decided this was worth breaking them for. She waited until I finished. Then she said, "Do you have a job or does Dad have the job?" I asked her what she meant. She said she'd told her friend at school that her mom worked, and her friend had said no. Your mom's home all the time, and Emma hadn't known how to explain it. She wasn't upset, she was just trying to sort the world into accurate categories, the way 9-year-olds do. I sat her down and I explained, for probably the first time in my life to anyone, in complete and unhedged detail, what I actually did. I told her about the healthcare network. I told her about a manufacturing company where the sales team and the production team had stopped talking to each other for 2 years, and it had cost them $4 million before anyone diagnosed why. I told her how I go in and figure out what's broken in the way people talk to each other inside a company, and then I build something better. She listened with her whole face, then she said, "That's really cool." And, after a pause, "Why doesn't Dad say it like that?" I didn't have an answer for her, or I had one, and it was too complicated and too sad to give to a 9-year-old. What I said was that sometimes people describe things in a shorthand that doesn't capture the whole thing. What I thought was, because he doesn't see it, and my daughter has noticed, and if she has noticed, then she is learning something from this house about whose work counts, and that is a lesson I cannot afford to let her learn. That was the moment something shifted internally. Not externally. I didn't confront Grant. I didn't issue any ultimatums. But something in me stopped accepting the arrangement as permanent. I started using precise language about my work in front of the kids. I started correcting the shorthand at dinner parties myself, gently, in real time. Actually, what I do is organizational systems for companies in crisis. Small acts of accuracy, repeated, not for Grant, for Emma, and for me. Theo, who was 6, absorbed a different version. He told his kindergarten class during some sharing exercise that his mom fixes companies that are broken, which his teacher repeated to me at pickup with an amused expression, and which was, again, more accurate than anything my husband had said about my work in 7 years. I laughed with the teacher. Then I sat in my car in the school lot for a few minutes before driving home, thinking about how both my children had independently arrived at a clearer description of my career than the man I shared a bed with, and how that was information about something, and how I had been very carefully not looking at what. Grant's company started having problems in the spring of what would become the 11th year of our marriage. I knew about it the way spouses know about things, in fragments, over dinner, in the tone of his voice when he came home later and later, in the specific tightness around his eyes that meant something at work was going badly in a way he couldn't control. The firm had grown fast. They doubled headcount in 3 years, acquired 2 smaller competitors, and expanded into a service line they didn't have the internal infrastructure to support. From what Grant told me, and he told me more than usual that spring, because he needed to talk and I was the person there, projects were slipping. Deliverables were arriving late or wrong. 2 major clients had escalated formally. There was a project in Ohio that had gone so sideways that the client had brought in their own attorneys to review the contract. He described all of this to me as a series of individual failures. This person dropped the ball. That team missed a deadline. This project manager wasn't strong enough. And I sat across the dinner table listening to him describe, symptom by symptom, one of the most textbook cases of organizational structure failure I had encountered in 8 years of doing this work. Every single thing he described was a downstream effect of the same upstream problem. They had scaled the headcount without scaling the decision-making architecture. Nobody knew who had authority over what anymore. Information was moving through informal channels that had worked at 90 employees and had completely broken at 240. I told him, gently, over several dinners, in the least threatening framing I could find. I said it sounded less like individual performance issues and more like a structural problem. I said I'd seen this exact pattern before, multiple times, and that it always looked like people failing until you mapped the actual flow of decisions. I offered, carefully, as a suggestion, not a pitch, to talk it through with him in more depth if it would help. He said, "It's a little more complicated than what you do." I want to be precise about how he said that. Not dismissively, almost apologetically, as though he were protecting me from a complexity I couldn't be expected to handle. That was somehow worse than dismissal. He genuinely believed he was being kind. And I sat there with 8 years of expertise in exactly the problem he was describing. And I said, "Okay," and passed him the salad, and understood with total clarity that I was going to have to stop hoping he would ever arrive at this on his own. I did keep listening, though. Not out of strategy, out of the ordinary reflex of being married to someone who is struggling. And the more he described, the clearer the picture became. He mentioned one night that 2 of his project managers had both independently told a client different delivery dates for the same milestone. He said it as an example of incompetence. I heard it as a symptom of a company where the same decision could be made in 2 places with no mechanism for reconciliation. He mentioned that a senior engineer had left after 17 years and that 3 separate processes had broken in the following month because nobody had known she was the one holding them together. He said it was a shame she'd left. I heard it as a company running on undocumented institutional memory in the head of one person. Every dinner, another piece. I was building the diagnostic in my head at my own kitchen table, months before anyone asked me to. The email from Daniel Whitfield came 4 months later. I need to explain how that happened, because it wasn't luck. 2 years earlier, I'd done an engagement with a regional construction firm, a 9-month rebuild of their project governance structure that had, by their own internal numbers, saved them somewhere north of $6 million in the following 18 months. The COO of that firm, a woman named Patricia Vance, had become something like a professional friend, and Patricia sat on the board of an industry association where she'd had drinks, apparently, with Daniel Whitfield, who had spent most of the conversation describing a firm quietly coming apart at the seams. Patricia gave him my name. She did not know my husband worked there. There is no version of this where anyone engineered the collision. It happened the way these things actually happen, through the accumulated, invisible weight of 8 years of doing good work in a small professional world where people talk to each other. So the email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was standing at my kitchen counter eating cold pasta. And after I'd laughed on the floor for a while, I did the only thing I could think to do, which was open a new document and start taking notes on everything Grant had told me over 4 months of dinners, because whatever else this situation was, it was also the largest professional opportunity of my career, walking directly into my inbox. I didn't tell Grant that night. I want to be honest about that, because I've thought about it a great deal since. I sat on it for 2 days. Part of that was strategic. I needed to know whether there was a conflict of interest issue, whether Daniel even knew whose spouse I was, whether the engagement was real or exploratory. But part of it, if I'm being fully honest, was something less clean. Part of it was that for 48 hours I got to hold this thing entirely by myself, unshrunk, undescribed, uncompressed into a hobby, and I wanted those 48 hours before I handed it to a room where it might get smaller. I replied to Daniel on Thursday. I asked, directly, whether he was aware that Grant worked in his organization. He wrote back within the hour. He was not aware. He had recognized my last name as familiar but hadn't connected it. He asked whether I considered it a conflict. I told him I'd need to think about the structure, but that I was interested in the engagement. He asked for a call the following Monday, and on Sunday night, at our kitchen table, after the kids had gone to bed, I told my husband that his company had asked me to come save it. I had rehearsed how to say it. That's the detail I find hardest to admit, looking back, that I sat in my car outside the grocery store on Saturday afternoon practicing sentences, trying to find a phrasing that would let him receive the news without it landing as a threat. 11 years of marriage and the largest professional validation of my life, and my first instinct was to figure out how to make it smaller and softer before it reached him. I found 4 different versions. I used the plainest one in the end because somewhere between the car and Sunday night I got tired of doing the work of protecting a man from the size of my own career. He didn't believe me at first. Not in an insulting way. His first reaction was genuine confusion. The way you react when a sentence contains all recognizable words in an order that doesn't parse. He said, "Daniel Whitfield emailed you?" I said yes. He said, "Our Daniel Whitfield?" I said yes. He asked to see it. I showed him the email on my laptop, and I watched my husband of 11 years read a formal, deferential, professionally urgent message from the most senior person in his company to the woman he had spent over a decade describing as having a consulting thing she does from home. I watched his face move through about 4 distinct expressions in the space of 15 seconds. Confusion, recognition, something that looked briefly like pride, and then, arriving underneath all of it and settling there, something much more complicated that took him weeks to be able to name out loud. His first question was, "Are you going to do it?" His second question, about 90 seconds later, was, "What does this mean for me?" That second question is the one that told me everything about where we actually were. Not what does this mean for you. After 8 years of work, most people would never get to see rewarded like this. What does this mean for me? And I understood, sitting there, that we had arrived at the actual center of the thing, which had never really been about whether he respected my work. It was about what my work meant for his position in the only hierarchy he'd ever been given to understand himself by. I said I didn't know yet. I said I'd ask Daniel for a call and that I'd need to think carefully about the conflict of interest structure. And then Grant said something I have thought about more than almost anything else he's said in 11 years. He said, "You can't take it." Not a question, not a request. He said, "You can't take it. Do you understand what it looks like if my wife comes in as a consultant? Do you understand what that does to me in that building?" And I said, quietly, because I wasn't angry yet, I was mostly just very clear. "For 11 years you have described my career as a hobby in front of every person we know. You have never once asked me to protect your image from your own words. But the moment my work has consequences for your standing, suddenly it's real enough to be a threat." He didn't have an answer. He got up from the table and went upstairs, and I sat in the kitchen alone until almost 2 in the morning. What I did during those hours, mostly, was think about whether he was right. Not about my taking the engagement, I knew I was taking it, but about the cost to him. Because that's the thing they don't tell you about finally being seen. You don't get to enjoy it cleanly. I sat in that kitchen and understood that my largest professional moment was going to arrive inside my husband's workplace, in front of every colleague whose opinion had structured his sense of himself for a decade, and that there was no version of this where he came out of it feeling larger. I did not want to hurt him. I have never wanted to hurt him. And I also knew, with complete clarity, that turning down the work to protect his standing would be the final, largest, most permanent version of every small compression I had accepted for 11 years. and that if I did it, I would never get the ground back. The next 3 weeks were the worst of our marriage, and I include in that comparison a stillbirth we survived at year 3 and a period of unemployment at year 5. Not because there was screaming, there was very little screaming, but because for 3 weeks we were finally, unavoidably standing in the room with something we had spent a decade arranging the furniture around. I took the call with Daniel. I structured the engagement carefully. I would report to Daniel directly. Grant's division would be within scope, but Grant himself would not be individually assessed by me. And I disclosed the relationship formally in writing to their general counsel before the contract was signed. It was the cleanest possible version of a genuinely complicated situation, and it was accepted, and I signed a contract for the largest engagement of my career on a Wednesday afternoon in June. Grant found out I'd signed before I told him, because Daniel mentioned it in a leadership meeting. He came home that night and stood in the doorway of the spare bedroom, my office, the room where all of it had been built, and he said, "Everybody knows." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you know what today was like for me?" And I said, "Tell me." And he did. He told me about a colleague clapping him on the back and saying, "Your wife's coming to fix us, huh?" He told me about the specific tone of a director in his division saying, "I didn't know your wife was a consultant." He told me he had felt, all day, like a man standing in a building he thought he understood, while everyone else could see something about him he couldn't see himself. I listened to the whole thing, and then I said, "That's what it's felt like for me at every dinner party for 11 years. He started to say something and stopped. He stood in that doorway for a long moment, and then he said, "That's not the same." I said, "You're right. It's not the same. It went the other direction for 11 years and you never noticed once." He went downstairs. I heard him make a drink. I heard him not turn on the television, which somehow felt significant. He just sat down there in the quiet, and I sat up here in mine, and we occupied the same house on 2 different floors for the rest of that night. The kids noticed. Of course they noticed. Emma asked me at breakfast 2 days later whether Dad and I were fighting, and I told her the truth in the most age-appropriate version I could manage, that I had gotten a very big job at Dad's company, and that it was complicated for him, and that we were working it out. She thought about that for a moment and said, "Is he embarrassed?" 13-year-olds are not subtle instruments, but they are extremely accurate ones. I said I thought maybe he was. A little. And Emma said, "That's kind of a weird thing to be embarrassed about." And I said yes. Yes, it is. And I left it there, because it wasn't my job to prosecute her father to her, and because she had already arrived, on her own, at the exact conclusion I'd spent 11 years hoping someone in that house would reach. I started the engagement the following Monday, and here is the part I did not anticipate, the part I could not have planned for. The work was extraordinary. Not easy. Extraordinary. The firm was a genuine mess, and it was the specific kind of mess I am very good at. And for the first 8 weeks, I did the best professional work of my life, inside a building where my husband had a parking space with his name on it. I interviewed 41 people. I mapped every decision pathway in the organization. I built a diagnostic that showed, in a single page, exactly how a decision about a project change order traveled through the company, through 6 informal touchpoints, and 2 people who had no formal authority, but had accumulated it through tenure, and how that pathway had worked fine at 90 employees, and was structurally guaranteed to fail at 240. When I presented that diagram to the executive team in week 9, the room went silent for about 11 seconds. Then Daniel Whitfield said, "That's it. That's the thing." And a woman from operations who had been at the firm for 16 years said quietly, "I've been trying to explain this for 2 years." Grant was in that room. I need to say that, because it matters to everything that came after. He was in that room, sitting 3 seats down from Daniel, watching his wife present a diagnostic that reframed everything his company had been experiencing as individual failure into a single legible structural problem. He didn't say anything during the meeting. He came home that night and sat down on the edge of our bed while I was reading, and he said, "I didn't know you could do that." 5 words. I didn't know you could do that. Not an apology. Not yet. but the first true thing he'd said about my work in 11 years. An admission, finally, of the actual dimension of the gap. He didn't know. He had built an entire marriage-length framework around a thing he had never once looked at directly, and then he'd sat in a conference room and watched it operate at full capacity, and the framework had broken. I put my book down. I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "How long have you been able to do that?" I said, "About 8 years." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know how to be okay with this." And it was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. And it was also, I understood, the actual beginning of whatever came next. I didn't reassure him. That's the choice I made in that moment. And I've thought about it since. And I stand by it. For 11 years, my reflex in this marriage had been to make the discomfort smaller, to soften, to reassure, to find the version of the sentence that let him stay comfortable. And I sat on that bed and I let him be uncomfortable. I said, "I know you don't." And then I picked my book back up, not coldly. I just didn't rescue him from it. He sat there for another minute or two, and then he said goodnight, and he went to brush his teeth, and something in the architecture of our marriage had moved about 1/4 of an inch, which does not sound like much, until you consider that it hadn't moved at all in over a decade. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. I'm telling this story because there are people watching this right now whose work has been described as something small by someone who loves them, and who have made peace with that description because the alternative felt like starting a war inside their own house. This next part is for you. We started therapy in September, 3 months into the engagement. It was Grant's idea, which I did not expect. He said it in the car on the way home from his parents' house, after his mother had made a comment about the consulting, and he had, for the first time in 11 years, corrected her. Not dramatically, he said. "Mom, she runs a firm. She's currently rebuilding my company." His mother said, "Oh," and changed the subject. And Grant drove for about 10 more minutes and then said, "I think we should talk to somebody. I don't know how to do this on my own." Our therapist was a man named Dr. Ellis, with a beard and an unnerving talent for silence. In the 4th session, he asked Grant to describe what he'd felt the first time he read Daniel's email. Grant said pride. Dr. Ellis waited. Grant said pride. And then, after a long pause, fear. Dr. Ellis asked what the fear was about, and Grant said something I will carry for the rest of my life. My father worked one job for 32 years, and the whole point of him was that he provided. That was the whole point. That's what a man was. And I've spent 11 years telling myself I was the provider and she had a hobby, because if she wasn't a hobby, then I don't know what I am. I sat in that room and watched my husband locate, out loud, the actual architecture of 11 years of small diminishments. It wasn't malice. It was never malice. It was a man protecting a definition of himself that he'd inherited whole and never examined. And every time he'd called my work a hobby, he had been, without knowing it, holding a wall in place. Dr. Ellis asked me what I'd felt during those 11 years. And I said the thing I hadn't said even to myself. I felt like I was becoming smaller in the only room that mattered to me. And I let it happen, because correcting him every time felt like it would cost more than the correction was worth. And I taught my daughter, by doing that, exactly how a woman is supposed to handle being made small. Grant put his hand over his face when I said the part about Emma. He didn't defend himself. He just sat there with his hand over his face for a long, long moment. Therapy did not fix it quickly. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this often skip from the revelation to the repair, as though those are the same event. They are not. We went for 14 months. There were sessions where Grant got defensive and sessions where I got cruel, and one session in February where I said something about his father that I regretted before I'd finished the sentence. There was a stretch in the spring where I genuinely did not know whether we were going to make it, where I looked at the logistics of separating and found that I could picture it clearly enough to frighten myself. What kept me in the room was not certainty. It was that he kept showing up, every session, on time, having done the uncomfortable work between them. and that a man who has spent 11 years not looking at something and then chooses, at 43, to look at it directly for 14 months, is doing something that deserves to be taken seriously. The engagement ran 14 months. By the end of it, the firm had a functioning decision architecture, 2 of the escalated clients had renewed, and the Ohio project had been closed out without litigation. Daniel Whitfield sent me a handwritten note, which almost nobody does anymore, thanking me for saving the company. I have it framed in the spare bedroom, which is still my office, because I still prefer the room with the good window and the door that closes. Grant left that firm 8 months ago, not because of me, or not only because of me. He'd started, somewhere in therapy, to examine whether the thing he'd been climbing was something he actually wanted to be at the top of, and the answer turned out to be complicated. He took a role at a smaller company with less prestige and better hours, and no parking space with his name on it. He says he's happier. I believe him, mostly. There are still days where I catch him measuring himself against a ruler his father handed him in 1987, and I don't think that ruler ever fully goes away for someone. But he catches himself now. That's the difference. Emma is 13. She told me last month that she wants to do what I do. I asked her what she thinks I do, and she said, "You go into companies where everyone's yelling at each other, and you figure out why, and you fix it." Which is, honestly, the most accurate professional description anyone in my life has ever given. I told her that was exactly right. Grant was in the room when she said it. He said, "Your mom's the best in the country at that." Just like that, casually, the way you say a fact. 11 years to get to a sentence like that, and about 4 seconds for him to say it. What I know now is that the word wasn't the wound. The word was just the visible part. The wound was that I had accepted a small description of myself in exchange for peace, and I had done it for so long that my daughter had started taking notes. The word stopped mattering the moment I stopped agreeing to it. If this story found something true in you tonight, follow this channel and send it to 5 people who might need to hear it the way you did. Leave a comment below, an honest one, not a polite one, and tell me about a time someone called your work small. And tell me what story you want to hear next. I'll be here. I'll see you in the next one.